April 1945. British and Canadian troops stormed the gates of Bergen Belsen, a Nazi concentration camp located in Lower-Saxony. According to intelligence reports, only prisoners of war were held there. Instead, what they found inside was tens of thousands of rotting corpses and dying people, mostly Jews. The camp had a staff of 480 Nazis working as guards or members of the Commandant's staff, including 45 women. The tribunal that judged the crimes at Bergen Belsen was lenient towards these women on account of their gender despite their unspeakable crimes. In truth, these women were some of the most cruel and bloodthirsty criminals to ever live in this planet. This is the story of the 9 female guards that were imprisoned and the 3 female guards that were hanged for their participation in genocide, including Irma Grese, the notorious Angel of Death. Together, these 12 riders of apocalypse were responsible for 50,000 deaths in Bergen Belsen. Welcome to the Marshal Memoirs. The gruesome hangings of female guards at Hamelin. The so-called Belsen trials happened 5 months after the liberation of the camp, even before the famous Nuremberg trials took place. The Belsen trial attracted considerable international media attention. It gave the world its first real glimpse of the fathomless horror of the Holocaust and of the death factory that was Auschwitz-Birkenau. It was also the first occasion on which film was submitted as evidence in a war crimes trial. War crime defendants were tried by British military courts at an old gymnasium in Lindenstrasse, in Lüneburg, the Curio House in Hamburg, at Wuppertal and elsewhere, e.g. Georg Otto Sandrock, and between 1945 and 1949, 937 persons were tried on war crimes charges by British military courts in the British zone of Germany. 677 of them were convicted, 230 being sentenced to death. 174 death sentences had been carried out by the end of 1945, most of them in the terrifying prison of Hamelin. It was not the Pied Piper, but a cold-blooded executioner named Albert Pierrepoint, who was appointed by the British Army to carry out the hangings. Despite him being a low-ranking officer, the Army directed that he was to be treated as the equivalent rank of Lieutenant Colonel. He was flown over to Germany for the specific task of conducting the executions and put in a luxurious hotel, where he was collected by jeep every day to be driven to the prison. A total of 191 men and 10 women were hanged at Hamelin, plus one man, Théophile Wallasek, who was shot. Albert Pierrepoint carried out all the hangings himself, and with great professionalism. He was assisted in the task by Company Sergeant Major Richard Anthony O'Neill, Sergeant James Hunter, Edwin James Roper, and Alexander Hurry. A British female prison governor or deputy governor had to be present at female executions. The deputy governor of Strangeways Prison, a woman named Wilson, was present for the first 3 on the 13th of December 1945. Apart from these people, the executions were carried out with a very limited audience. In total, 146 men and the 10 women were hanged for war crimes. A gallows was set up in the west wing of the main prison building in the Lower Saxon town of Hamelin. This wing was kept separate from the rest of the prison. The gallows was modelled on the design of the one at Pentonville Prison in London, which had trapdoors wide enough to permit double hangings, which were the norm here. Prisoners were permitted the services of a minister of their religion prior to execution. Despite a woman being present for the hangings, it was Pierrepoint himself who insisted on doing the whole procedure when hanging the 3 women guards of Bergen Belsen. It is reported that he had a special hatred for women, and that he seemed to be enjoying it. When Irma Grese, the youngest woman to ever be sentenced to death under British law, walked up to the gallows, Pierrepoint was ecstatic. He tried to place the black hood over Grese's head, but she refused and violently tried to shake it off. She wanted to be able to see Pierrepoint to his eyes until the final second, but finally the guards held her while the executioner placed the black hood. Some witnesses claimed that he even slapped her in the face, but this is not confirmed in the written report. What is confirmed is that Grace, who was 22 at the time, yelled "Schnell," meaning quickly, while waiting for Pierrepoint to pull the lever. But it was not a quick death. Pierrepoint, an experienced executioner who had been overseeing these procedures for over 15 years, placed the noose wrongly in Grace's neck, causing her a painful death by strangulation, rather than her neck snapping. It became apparent to all the witnesses that this was done on purpose, because of all the contempt Pierrepoint held towards the young angel of death. Johanna Bormann was next. She was a very small woman, which earned her the nickname Weasel. Completely defeated, she warned the executioner. "I have my feelings," she said. Her execution was quick and relatively painless. So was that of Elisabeth Volkenrath, who had claimed during the trial that life conditions in the camp were unbearable, not only to the prisoners, but to her and other common workers. Despite this incredible claim, she was sentenced and died at the gallows in December 1945, together with her former colleagues. The bloody liberation of the Bergen Belsen concentration camp. Liberation of the camps did not end the dying. Thousands of people who had been starved, beaten, and worked to exhaustion died within their first week of freedom. For many, their bodies simply gave out. For many others, the rich food the rescuers thought would nourish them to strength was more than their deprived systems could handle. In Dachau, the daily death rate in the days following liberation was 200. In Bergen Belsen, it was almost 500. Storming Bergen Belsen was not among the plans of the Allies. In early April 1945, troops of the British 11th Armoured Division were mobilizing across northern Germany near Hamburg in the direction of Berlin. It was part of the final push towards Allied victory over the forces of Nazism. At one point, they were met by a German man carrying a white flag. He claimed to have come from a place called Bergen Belsen, and he requested a truce. The British officers in charge of the division were not interested in negotiating with him, but the camp of Bergen Belsen lay further ahead on their path of advance. They thought it was a good opportunity to free some of their comrades who were possibly held captive in the prisoner of war camp without firing a round. Thus they agreed to go to Bergen Belsen. There was a catch, however. The envoy sent to negotiate the truce explained that typhus had taken hold in a prison camp there, and that there was a danger of the disease spreading beyond its confines. On the 15th of April, soldiers of the 63rd Anti-Tank Regiment were the first to enter the Belsen camp. Nothing they could have seen in the 6 years of war could have prepared them for what they found inside the camp. When the Allied soldiers stormed the camp in April 1945, they found 60,000 people who were dying and 13,000 corpses. Because of the typhus outbreak and the lack of manpower, nobody had bothered to bury the deceased. During the following days and weeks, it is estimated that 500 people died every day due to the ongoing typhus epidemic that had been going on in the camp for months. The 15th of April was a happy day for the inmates at the concentration camp, but their suffering was far from over. Bergen Belsen was never meant to become an extermination facility. However, due to the cruelties of the war and the inexperience of the British and then Canadian soldiers who liberated it, the number of casualties was unusually large, and perhaps the most tragic fact is that out of the 50,000 people that died at Bergen Belsen, around 35,000 lives were lost just in the few months before the liberation. These Jews never knew how close they came to being finally free. In the weeks and months that followed, British soldiers, medical personnel and volunteers brought a certain degree of order into the ghastly chaos. The dead were buried, the sick were treated and rehabilitated, barely living skeletons began to have their humanity restored to them, and the children even began to enjoy fun and games again. Once the situation was somewhat contained, the British turned their attention to those who had been responsible for the atrocities that were revealed to the world in April 1945. Foremost amongst these was the Commandant of the Belsen camp at the time of its liberation, SS Captain Josef Kramer. Kramer had been in charge of Belsen concentration camp since December 1944, having previously been a senior camp administrator at Auschwitz, where he oversaw many of the gassings of Jews in the Birkenau subcamp. Towards the end of the war, because Bergen Belsen was located in the heart of the German land, it became a reception camp for many of the prisoners evacuated from camps further east as the Soviet army advanced westwards. This, of course, resulted in the chronic overcrowding, starvation and disease discovered by the British liberating forces. These conditions were made even worse by Kramer's brutal regime, which earned him the nickname of the Beast of Belsen. During his time in Bergen Belsen, the camp became one of the most deadly, perhaps the most deadly camp in Germany without a gas chamber. Revenge kills, the first Nazi deaths after liberation. On the days leading to the liberation, most of the SS staff who were at the camp were allowed to leave. Only a small number of SS men and women, including the camp commandant Kramer, remained to secure order inside the camp. The outside walls of the camp system were guarded by Hungarian and regular German troops. Incredibly, some of the Germans were later allowed to go back to the German front lines by the British. As the British lacked sufficient manpower to control the camp and help the inmates, they allowed the Hungarians to remain in charge of security, and only the Commandant Joseph Kramer was arrested. This proved a great mistake, as the situation became confusing for the prisoners themselves. In their eyes, it seemed like the only thing that had changed at first was who was controlling the camp. Now the British were in charge, but instead of freeing the Jews, they kept them in their barracks under supervision of the same people who had tortured most of them. On one of the first days after liberation, SS and Hungarian guards shot and killed some of the starving prisoners who were trying to steal food supplies from the storehouses. Following this bloodbath, the British realized they needed to take active control of the situation inside the camp. They struggled to provide emergency medical care, clothing and food, which provoked many deaths that could be avoided. But the SS guards were not the only ones to exert violence under the lax supervision of the British. Immediately following the liberation, revenge killings took place in one of the satellite camps, which the SS had created in the area of the army barracks that later became Hohne Camp. Hohne would become an important training ground for British soldiers during the Cold War. In early April 1945, around 15,000 prisoners from the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp had been relocated there. These prisoners were in much better physical condition than most of the others, and they had been placed in the barracks indistinctly along the kapos who had been their overseers at Mittelbau. As soon as the British took care of the situation, and understanding they would turn a blind eye on everything that happened in the satellite camp, thousands of prisoners attacked the 170 kapos that were present in the barracks. They did not have any weapons, so they would just take turns to punch them and then stomp them on the ground, while other inmates held their arms. Such was the hatred against these prisoners who acted as guards for the Nazis, that when British authorities came into the barracks to see what was happening, all they found was puddles of blood and pulp that could not be identified as a human being. On April 20th, the camp was attacked by 4 German fighter planes, probably alerted of their position by the German soldiers that were allowed to go back to the front lines by the British. As a result, 3 British medical orderlies died, and the water supply of the camp was damaged, which in turn provoked more deaths because of dehydration. Over the next days, the surviving prisoners were deloused and moved to a nearby German Panzer Army camp, which became the Bergen Belsen Displaced Persons Camp. Over a period of 4 weeks, almost 29,000 of the survivors were moved to the Displaced Persons Camp. Before the handover, the SS had managed to destroy the camp's administrative files, thereby eradicating most written evidence. The British did force the former SS camp personnel to help bury the thousands of dead bodies in mass graves. It was the same task the SS had asked the inmates to do over and over again in the past. The British knew this and gave the SS personnel the same treatment they had given the Jewish and Polish prisoners before. The SS men were given starvation rations, not allowed to use gloves or other protective clothing, and were continuously shouted at and threatened to make sure that they did not stop working. Some of the bodies were so rotten that arms and legs tore away from the torso. Within 2 months, 17 staff members had died of typhus due to being forced to handle the bodies with no protection. Another committed suicide, and 3 others were shot and killed by British soldiers after trying to escape. Albert Pierrepoint, the British Army's vicious executioner. Unlike the American Army after the Nuremberg trials, the British had decided to give the important task of executing the Nazis to someone with ample experience. A man named Albert Pierrepoint was selected, who had been a hangman for the British Army for 15 years, first as assistant executioner and then as lead executioner. Over his 25-year career, he would go on to execute 600 people. Albert Pierrepoint actually came from a family of hangmen. His father, Henry, and his uncle, Thomas, had been executioners before him. Henry Pierrepoint had in fact written several letters to the Home Office in London, asking to be appointed one of the King of England's executioners. He was finally inscribed in the list of executioners in 1901, and by 1905 he was considered the principal executioner of all Britain. Henry Pierrepoint was ultimately erased from the official executioners list in 1910, when he reportedly showed up to work in an inebriated state. Over his 10-year career, he would participate in more than 100 hangings. His son, Albert Pierrepoint, would greatly surpass that number. He had known from an early age that he wanted to become a hangman like his father and uncle, and was taken on as an assistant executioner in September 1932, at the age of 27. His first execution was in December of the same year, in which he worked alongside his proud uncle Tom. In October 1941, he undertook his first hanging as lead executioner. Pierrepoint was already famous within his line of work before the Belsen trials. He would go on to hang several war criminals in Germany and Austria, but before the war, he was the main executioner in a number of high-profile cases in Britain. He ended the lives of Gordon Cummins, known as the Blackout Ripper, John Hay, the Acid Bath Murderer, and John Christie, nicknamed the Rillington Place Strangler. He was known for his attention to detail, always taking the time to test the gallows with a weighted bag first, so that no surprises would happen at the time of the execution. He also took notes of the height and weight of the prisoners, so he could carefully calculate the exact length of rope to use for each one, and also the length of the drop. During the war, he was tasked with hanging 15 German spies as well as some United States servicemen who had committed capital crimes in England. In December 1941, he executed the famous spy Karl Richter, who had been captured after parachuting into England's soil. For the Belsen trials, he was sent abroad for the first time, and he set up his offices at the Hamelin prison in Lower-Saxony. Pierrepoint travelled several times to Hamelin, and between December 1948 and October 1949, he executed 226 people, often over 10 a day, and on several occasions groups of up to 17 over 2 days. However, for his first few hangings, he took his time. These were the Nazis condemned at the Belsen trials, the SS men and women responsible for war crimes in the Bergen Belsen concentration camp. 3 women and 10 men were hanged on the 13th of December, 1945. He first executed the women, one at a time, starting with Irma Grese. Then he hanged the men, 2 at a time, as the specially built gallows were designed for this purpose. When he pulled the lever, the trapdoor under both men opened, and they plummeted to their deaths. It is reported that all the men and the women, with the exception of Grese, died instantly from a snapped neck. Pierrepoint retired in 1956, after the government failed to pay him his full fee when an execution was called off at the last minute. He considered this attitude disrespectful after 25 years of service, so he sent the telegram of resignation immediately afterwards. The last years of his life were spent running a pub together with his wife in the town of Southport, close to Liverpool. He died on the 10th of July, 1992, aged 87, in the nursing home where he had lived for the last 4 years of his life. Irma Grese, the hyena of Auschwitz, becomes the angel of death. Irma Grese earned many nicknames along her short but cruel career. She was feared by both prisoners and guards, who called her the beautiful beast on account of her unconventional beauty. After all, she was only 19 years old when she became a female guard at Auschwitz. Soon enough, she became known as the hyena of Auschwitz, and later on, the bitch of Belsen. Finally, the newspapers reported her demise in 1945 under the moniker of the Angel of Death, a name she shared only with Josef Mengele, one of the most evil members of the SS. Grese had quit school at the age of 15, a short time after her mother ended her own life. A Nazi fanatic from an early age, she joined the SS and devoted her time to the organization's activities. When she was 18 years old, Grese volunteered for training in the Ravensbrück concentration camp, making her father furious after finding her new work uniform. Grese denounced her father, and he was arrested soon after. At that time, she realized that she enjoyed the sense of power she got by forcing people to do her will. At Ravensbrück, her only thought was to finally become a full-time concentration camp guard. Her opportunity came in 1942, when she was finally appointed as guard at Ravensbrück. She had arrived there in April 1941, but was told to come back 6 months later, once she turned 18. Due to her good performance, she was transferred to Auschwitz in early 1943, where she was put in charge of 18,000 female prisoners. There were around 2,500 female guards in all the Nazi camps, but Grese was without a doubt the worst of them all. She did not see working at the camps only as a means of satisfying her sadistic desires, but also her sexual ones. Irma first started having intimate relations with male SS officers at Ravensbrück. Sexual relations between the SS and prisoners were strictly prohibited, but intercourse between SS of opposite sexes were encouraged. According to witnesses, all of the female guards, married or unmarried, had one or more constant SS lovers. It typically took a month to train an SS female guard to her fullest depraved potential of sadism. Grese was trained in 3 weeks. She felt as though she had reached a major milestone and achievement in her life at that moment. Brutality was part of the concentration camp system, but Grese's sadistic excesses in terms of sexual perversions and brutal beatings were, for the most part, rare. Most of the female guards were not brutally cruel. Grese participated in inmate beatings at Ravensbrück, and this was merely a part of her training. She earned 54 Reichsmarks per month, significantly less than what her colleagues earned. In Ravensbrück, she trained under Theodora Binz and learned to be sadist, as Binz was one. Binz continued to serve in Ravensbrück during the entire war. She had begun her career in September 1940 and became an SS chief overseer by 1943. She held this rank until the end of the war, and finally she was sentenced to be hanged on May 2, 1947, in Hamelin, at the same place where her disciple was hanged 2 years before. Grese became notorious in her role as a guard and is remembered by many survivors as wearing heavy boots and carrying a whip and pistol. Every survivor account refers to these 3 sadistic objects Grese became infamous for owning and using. Grese used her whip and pistol to punish inmates for the slightest infractions of camp rules and was fond of lashing well-endowed women across the breasts with her whip. Many of the women developed infections in their breasts from injuries caused by the braided wire end of her cellophane whip. An inmate was called upon by Grese to operate on these women with an unsterilized knife, but she had no anesthesia available for these operations. The women screamed in agony. Grese also employed 1 or 2 huge dogs as part of her brutal reign in the Bergen Belsen women's camp. Survivors recall her riding around camp on a bicycle with a dog at her side, accompanying the female inmates on their 16-kilometer trek to work. If they couldn't keep up with the column, she ordered her dog to attack them without mercy. Elisabeth Volkenrath, deciding who lives and who dies. Less vicious than Grese, and 4 years her senior, was another of the female guards hanged at Hamelin, Elisabeth Volkenrath. However, she was not just another camp employee. Her career started in October 1941 as a guard at Ravensbrück concentration camp. There she met Irma Grese, who would be her superior officer both in Auschwitz and in Bergen Belsen. Volkenrath was sent to Auschwitz in early 1942, but without receiving a promotion. She simply had not shown the same amount of sadism that Irma Grese did. That is why Grese became her boss. At Auschwitz, Volkenrath met her future husband, a SS block leader named Heinz. Together they became a deadly couple. Both Heinz and Elisabeth participated actively in the selection of people who would go to the gas chambers in Auschwitz, either in the female or the male wings of the death camp. Volkenrath finally earned a reputation for murdering Jews in Auschwitz, which in turn earned her a promotion to chief overseer for all the female camp sections at Auschwitz. She carried this position until the camp was liberated by the Allies, at which time she fled and was sent to Bergen Belsen, at the heart of the German homeland. There she continued with the killings, this time by means of starvation and denial of medical attention instead of gassing. Witnesses during the Belsen trials claimed that female guards killed the weaker ones and threw many of the girls onto the ground and trampled on them. Just like their male counterparts, the female guards upon entering the camps were trained to become hardened and to punish prisoners severely when necessary. Many became accustomed to beating and kicking prisoners, sometimes to the point of death, with their jackboots, sticks, truncheons, and, like the case of Irma Grese, with a whip made of cellophane. Volkenrath had no whip, but she carried a gun everywhere she went inside the camp. When she testified during the Belsen trials, Elisabeth Volkenrath stated that she had participated in tortures. For example, she would make prisoners hold their hands above their heads for long periods of time. Those who lowered them would get beatings. However, she stated that it was always on orders from others. According to her, she could not disobey these orders or she would be punished or imprisoned. As other prisoners did during the trials, Volkenrath did admit to having participated in torturing the prisoners. However, she does not feel completely responsible for her actions. Furthermore, she tried to save the skin of others. She claimed during the trial that she talked to the Commandant several times, informing him about what was going on in the camp. She claims to have asked him why the prisoners did not get more, to which she was told that the railways had been bombed, so there was no way to get food for the camp. During the last months at Belsen, Volkenrath was in charge of the bathhouse for women prisoners. There was no coal available, so every prisoner had to take a cold bath and then dress up quickly. Those prisoners who did not dress quickly enough were punished by beatings. Still undressed and wet in cold water, the girls would be beaten with sticks in the cold snow until they were unresponsive. At that time, their blockmates had to drag them and their clothes back to the barracks. Elisabeth Volkenrath's work in Bergen Belsen was very short but bloody. She threw prisoners down the stairs, slammed them against the walls, and beat them mercilessly. Volkenrath arrived at Bergen Belsen on 5 February 1945 and was appointed chief overseer. She became sick within days of beginning her new job and was sent to the hospital. She was unable to return to work for over a month. When she returned to work, Volkenrath tried to make up for the lost time. Volkenrath was later accused of heinous, nightmarish crimes while she was at Auschwitz and at Bergen Belsen, from abuse, torture, and participating in selections, although she would adamantly insist that she took no part in. She argued at her trial that she simply observed and kept order. Thanks to the testimony of eyewitnesses, she was finally charged for crimes that were atrocious and deliberate in nature. Juana Bormann, a sadistic instrument of torture. Juana, or Johanna, Bormann was born on the 10th of September 1893 in the town of Birkenfelde, East Prussia. She never married. At her trial, Bormann stated that she went to work for the SS only to make more money, but it can also be inferred by her actions that she was extremely lonely, embittered, and conceivably looking for something in life that would make her feel important, which the SS provided. Bormann was also considerably older than many of the other guards. Bormann was over 50 at the time of her arrest, was not an attractive woman, and did not physically appear, at least in her court photos, to fit the Nazi feminine ideal, like the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Irma Grese did. Before she was employed as a guard, Bormann had worked for an insane asylum. While employed at the asylum, Bormann only made 20 marks per month. Evidence has suggested that she was involved with the T4 program for euthanasia of the insane. According to her testimony, Bormann became part of the SS as a civilian employee in March 1938 in order to increase her income. Once she went to work in the camp system, she made more than 150 marks per month, considerably more than she had made at other jobs. She was initially assigned to work at Ravensbrück as a kitchen helper and later became a guard. In this position, she was known for her cruelty and propensity for violence, often applied by her dog. On the 15th of May 1943, Bormann was assigned to work at Auschwitz. While there, she probably took part in selections for Dr. Josef Mengele, the Nazi doctor responsible for some of the most gruesome medical experiments of the Holocaust, but Bormann denied these charges at her trial. Bormann was then sent to the Birkenau detachment, where she stayed until December of 1943. Another assignment led her to Budi, a detachment of Birkenau. While at Birkenau, Bormann was assigned to work as a commando and took part in selections, although she denied this at her trial. She was finally sent to Bergen Belsen, where, according to her own words, she was put in charge of looking after the camp pigs. She used her status to engage in barbaric abuses. These included beatings, whippings, and savage torture against prisoners who tried to steal the pigs' food. Dogs continually provided her a way to express her power over the innocents. While employed at the camps, Bormann used her dog to attack prisoners. Several female survivors related horrific accounts about Bormann and her sadistic use of her dog or dogs. Numerous accounts existed that corroborated the fact that Bormann continually used a dog to punish prisoners. In her defense, Bormann stated at her trial that she had purchased a dog as a pet and only kept the animal as such. She also stated that she had given her dog away and had not had him while she was working at Budi, but that she only took the dog back once it fell ill. She stated that she certainly did not use the animal for any attacks against prisoners under her care, despite the fact that 5 different survivors testified to the contrary at her trial. She was said to have set her dog on a menstruating prisoner in Bergen Belsen, although Bormann always claimed that her dog was only a pet and was not an official SS-trained dog, nor was she ever granted permission to use her dog at work. It is unclear why she so emphatically denied that she had ever let her dog attack anyone, as if she was attempting to save the dog's reputation. Many horrifying accounts came from female prisoners who witnessed Bormann's use of her dog to hurt inmates. Further evidence comes from the words of Heinrich Himmler himself, who actively encouraged the use of dogs as a tool for the women guards in the death camps. Herta Ehlert, innocent until asked to kill. The case of Herta Ehlert is very clear in demonstrating how seemingly innocent and harmless individuals can very quickly become death machines. Ehlert had been working as a bakery assistant in Berlin until she was called for SS work by the labor exchange on the 15th of November 1939. Women were not allowed to actually join the SS, but they could work for them, and it was not uncommon for SS to issue official uniforms and credentials to women. During her trial, Ehlert always maintained that she was a conscript when she began working as a novice at Ravensbrück concentration camp. As a result, she always held minor positions and did not take part in any torture or killing. According to her own words, all she had to do in Ravensbrück was to see that civilian workers did not mix with the prisoners, and later on she accompanied working parties outside the camp. In October 1942, she was moved as a female guard to the Majdanek camp near Lublin, Poland. Again, according to her testimony in trial, she claimed she was moved as a punishment for being too nice to the prisoners by not giving them harsh enough punishments and helping to feed them. However, according to the Belsen trial, she had received a bonus, as well as better working conditions at this camp. This extra money proved that she had not been punished. By mid-1944, she was transferred to Krakow. There, SS officers noticed she was too lenient, polite and helpful to the prisoners, so the SS returned her to Ravensbrück to undergo another training course, this time by Dorothea Binz. During this time, Ehlert divorced her husband. Binz had also been the trainer of Irma Grese and others, and faithful to her reputation, she made a ruthless killer out of Ehlert. Ehlert was later moved to the Auschwitz concentration camp as a female overseer, where she oversaw women who were in charge of commandos. Ehlert later served as a guard at the Auschwitz subcamp in Rajsko, Poland, before she was transferred to the Bergen Belsen concentration camp, where she became deputy wardress under the direct orders of Elisabeth Volkenrath and Irma Grese. It was during this time that she committed most of the crimes she was ultimately convicted of. Herta Ehlert was the exact opposite of Irma Grese. She was immensely obese and had problems walking around, but she was also sly, vicious in character, and an absolute master in using the whip. At first, she was not in charge of the prisoners. She was barely the overseer in charge of the kitchen. Through a small window, she would spy on the Jewish women while they were at work, peeling potatoes or onions, washing dishes, and doing other chores necessary in the kitchen. Once, Ehlert even ordered the women who were at work to undress completely. After they had stripped, Ehlert searched each one of them extremely thoroughly, looking, no doubt, for rings, money, wristwatches, and other valuables. She remained at her job until the final liquidation of the Krakow camp. A few days before liberation, she was sent on the death march together with thousands of prisoners, and she eventually reached Bergen Belsen, where she was employed during the last few months of the war. When the British Army liberated the Belsen camp, Ehlert was arrested and tried at the Belsen trial. While on trial, Ehlert was asked if she had committed theft, witnessed severe beatings, had committed murder, and so on, to which she had denied all of the accusations. However, there were multiple eyewitnesses who claimed to having experienced torture and beatings on her part. Ehlert pleaded not guilty to all charges. She was found guilty at Belsen and innocent at the Krakow camp, where there was not enough evidence to convict her. Ehlert was sentenced to 15 years in prison, but her sentence was later reduced 12 years, and finally she was released early on 7th May 1953. She had completed barely half of the initial sentence and lived the rest of her life as a free woman. Herta Botha, How to Get Away with Murder. Herta Botha was born on the 8th of January 1921 in Tetterow, Mecklenburg. Botha came of age when the power of the Nazi Party was rising. Little is known about her social class or her family life. She may have had problems with literacy and could have viewed working for the SS in the camp structure as an upward socio-economic move. Both held different jobs, which included working as a domestic until she decided to train as a nurse. Her nursing training lasted for a very short period until she went to work in the camp structure. In October of 1942, Botha was conscripted to work as an overseer at Ravensbrück. During her training at Ravensbrück, she was taught to manage a commando. She stayed at Ravensbrück for over a week before being sent to Stutthof, near Danzig. She stayed at Stutthof for 2 years, until July 1944, when she was sent to Bromberg. After 6 months, in January 1945, she was forced to evacuate the area along with other camp personnel. Botha, along with other Nazi personnel, marched for 6 weeks until they reached Bergen Belsen. In Bergen Belsen, Botha initially worked in the bathhouse, but later she was assigned to the Wood Commando, a position she held until the British Army captured her in April 1945. While in charge of the commando, Botha supervised about 60 prisoners. Male and female prisoners were both used for slave labor purposes in the Wood Commando, and Botha was one of the few overseers assigned to the duty alongside a male SS guard. She denied at her trial having carried any weapons to help her control the prisoners, but did admit to using her hands to slap any prisoner who attempted to steal. However, numerous survivors testified that while the prisoners were carrying their meager food rations, Botha shot at them for sport. Part of Botha's duties was to ensure that wood was delivered to the kitchen and other areas of the camp where wood was needed. While Botha was employed at Bergen Belsen, several survivors relate that she beat inmates with her fists and pieces of wood for minor infractions, such as stealing scraps of food or wood. At her trial, it was related that when she was first assigned to the bathhouse at Bergen Belsen, she beat a naked woman with a rubber stick, certainly inflicting grave harm and pain. Botha admitted that while working in the Wood Commando, where part of her duties included securing wood from the forested areas surrounding Bergen Belsen, that she would beat or slap prisoners for stealing, but denied ever using extreme force or objects other than her hands to punish people. Her strategy during the trial was, like in the case of some of the other women, to deny taking part in killings and to have only followed orders. At her trial, she continually asserted that she was ordered to do everything that she did, but sometimes she did not follow orders when she deemed them too harsh on the prisoners. One survivor alleged that Botha beat a Hungarian Jew named Eva to death with a block of wood for reasons unknown, and another prisoner testified to have seen Botha shoot 2 prisoners in the back, again for no apparent reason. Her defense at her trial reminded the court that several witnesses also testified that Botha never carried a pistol, but others testified otherwise. Both also allegedly beat a woman for stealing turnip peels, which was a beating so severe that the woman died from the injuries. After Botha realized the woman was dead, she ordered some of the women inmates to remove and dispose of the body. Both only admitted at her trial that there were many cases of prisoners stealing from her commando unit, but that when she caught the thieves in the act, the only punishment she meted out was a minor slap on the face with her hands, and then would set about to try to recover the stolen items. Her defense attorney maintained that Botha was only 24 when captured, and had arrived to work at Bergen Belsen when conditions had already disintegrated. Thus, her attorney argued, Botha could not be held responsible for the conditions of the camp. This was convincing to the authorities, and it was long debated whether to convict Botha or not. Finally, it was decided that she would serve a sentence of 10 years in prison, but was finally released on the 21st of December, 1951. Irene Haschke, cold-blooded killer and cook. Little is known about Irene Haschke apart from the fact that she worked for a few months in the kitchen of Bergen Belsen. Apparently, she had been a textile factory worker for the most part of the war, until in 1944 she was recruited by the SS to work in the camps as a guard. She was 23 at the time. Despite her short participation in the crimes committed in Bergen Belsen, her name was mentioned by several of the witnesses. Several witnesses testified that Haschke liked to spill the prisoners' soup and would not give them another ration, so they had to wait until the following meal to get something to eat or drink. When she was not in the kitchen, she liked to walk around the camp with a rubber stick, frequently beating girls for no apparent reason. About 14 days before the liberation, a woman went to get water from a water cistern at Belsen, and Haschke pushed the woman into the water. The woman was drowned, and Haschke ordered 2 other girls to fish her out of the cistern and bury her in a nearby lot. It is worthy of mention that Haschke never had duties related to the repression of inmates, only to oversee the work being done in cookhouses 2 and 3 at the camp. Everything she did was completely on her own. She frequently took out her rage against the inmates, at the kitchen and elsewhere, and prisoners were especially scared of her bouts of violence precisely because they were unprovoked. She simply started beating prisoners whenever she felt like it, for no reason at all. Hurting unarmed people was a sport for her. At her trial, she admitted to having beaten prisoners who spilled their soup, thus making a mess in the kitchen floor. She also claimed that most of the crimes she was accused of, it was actually two of her male supervisors who carried them out, Carl Francio and Nicholas Jenner, the two head cooks. However, most testimonies pointed at her as the culprit, and so she was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Nothing is known about the life of Hashka after being freed in 1951. She had no known family at the time or a permanent residence. The British intelligence was notorious for not following up on freed Nazis, many of which continued to profess the same ideas for decades after the end of the war. The case of Hashka is similar to that of Herta Ehlert. Two women who had never hurt a fly were placed inside a machine destined to cause only pain and death, and they delivered exactly what was expected of them. None of them expressed any regrets for what they had done or sympathies for the victims. To them, they were just prisoners who would be dead one day or another, expendable victims without a future of rights. Either acting upon direct orders or on their own accord, they committed some of the worst crimes known to humankind and paid the price for that. All the women mentioned here have provoked innumerable deaths and an enormous amount of suffering to tens of thousands. Despite their claims that they were only following orders, the chilling testimonies of hundreds of victims during the few months of the Belsen trials helped establish their culpability. They received a just punishment. The lesser offenders got 10 years in jail, and the most prominent and vicious killers were hanged in the prison of Hamelin. Irma Grese, the bitch of Belsen, Elisabeth Volkenrath, the sadistic SS wife, and Juana Bormann, who used her dog to torture and kill prisoners, all deserve to meet such an obscure and tragic end.